Glad to have you here with us. We're going to have a, kind of like we do usually on our Sunday evenings, just bump it up a few hours. We're going to have a period of Bible study here looking at the topic of marriage. And then we'll have an invitation and offer the Lord's Supper again and all in just a little bit. This, we're going to start off with, is not new. We talked about this, I think about a month ago now. We finally sort of got to introduce the idea of marriage and defining marriage. We didn't get through all of it. So I will pick up and slow down in a second. But because it had been so long since we looked over this, I did want to kind of give a quick refresher of what we had discussed. Merriam-Webster defines marriage as the state of being united as spouses in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. But you notice from that definition, we say nothing about gender. We say nothing about number. We say nothing about duration. We say nothing about the spiritual aspects of marriage. And so while this is the way the world commonly defines marriage, I don't consider that to be as complete as it needs to be. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, you call tail a leg, you still only have 4 legs on a dog, right? Because it doesn't matter what you call the tail, it's still a tail. We want to make sure that what we are calling marriage is actually marriage. Marriage, of course, has its origin in God. We don't see any sort of biological evidence for the development of marriage. That is, you don't see any lower forms of marriage in the animal kingdom. As a matter of fact, while some animals are monogamous, that is, they only have one partner for life, it's typically not the mammals. It's mostly birds. Chimpanzees, which are our nearest relative by DNA percentage, are aggressively polygamous. There are a number of we would expect to see very vast differences among different societies in regards to marriage, if marriage was just the invention of man. But what we see is pretty much a consistent idea of marriage around the world. That marriage itself as an institution is universal and very, very old. And of course, the Bible confirms that, telling us that God is the instigator of marriage. We see that all the way back in Genesis chapter 2. Because marriage is from God, God sets the rules for marriage. And by the way, it's a divine institution, but it is not a uniquely Christian institution. That is, before there was a Christianity, there was marriage. So, again, like I said, moving through this quickly. What constitutes marriage? Well, there are 2 sub-questions, the gender and the number. Concerning gender, the Bible always presents marriage as a relationship between a man and a woman. 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, for example, because of fornications, let each man have his own wife, let each woman have her own husband. And homosexual reunions were always condemned in Scripture. Whether you're talking about the patriarchal age, you've got the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Whether you're talking about the Mosaical age, we've got passages like Leviticus 18 and verse 22, where it's described as an abomination. Whether you're talking about the Christian age, where Paul describes such behavior as unnatural and unseemly, Romans 1, 26 and 27. Marriage, as defined by God, has always been a union between a male and female. But concerning number, then, it's God's design, one man and one woman. That's the original, right? That was the pattern that God created and established in the garden. How many helpmeets did he create for Adam? 1, Eve. Polygamy was the invention of sinful man, and polygamy is not permitted under the Christian era. Again, 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, because of fornications, let each man, 1, have his own wife, 1, and let each woman, each wife, have her own man. But that still, by the way, doesn't completely cover it, because you also want to remember God is to be a partner in every marriage. What is the duration of marriage? I think this is the last point that we kind of talked about. So this is the last one we're going to kind of quickly go by. The marriage bonds do not continue after death. Remember, that was the conclusion that Jesus reached when he was asked by the Sadducees in Matthew chapter 22. This hypothetical situation of levirate marriage gone amok, where there were 7 different brothers who all were married to the same woman, and they wanted to know in the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? And what was Jesus' response? In the resurrection, we're like what? We neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven, he says in Matthew 22 and verse 29. Consequently, those who are widowed are free to remarry, as we see in Romans 7, verses 2 and 3. But what about terminating marriage before death? One may separate, but not be free to remarry. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11. Paul writes, "But unto the married I give charge, yea, not I, but the Lord. Let the wife depart not from her husband, but should she depart, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband." The only reason given in Scripture that one may leave their current spouse and be married to another is for fornication. We see that in Matthew 19 and verse 9. "I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife except for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. But he that marrieth her when she is put away committeth adultery." I understand. Some want to try and limit the force of that statement to Christians only, but remember, marriage is a divine institution, not merely a Christian institution. The laws of marriage apply to all people. So then, what is the nature of marriage? Is marriage a civil union? Is it a religious union? Is it some of both? Which is it? Ultimately, it's both. I know that because one can be married in the eyes of the law, but an adulterer in the eyes of God. Again, looking at Matthew 19 and verse 9, "I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except for fornication, and shall marry another." Now, by the law, by society, he is what? Well, he's free to marry, and he is in a marriage. But by God, he's counted as what? An adulterer. The person was divorced and remarried in the eyes of the land, but counted as an adulterer in the eyes of God. One can be unmarried in the eyes of the law, but still married to their original spouse in the eyes of God. Same situation where there's that divorce that has taken place for some other reason. By the law of the land, you might be separated from your first husband, first wife, but in the eyes of God, you are still married. But must one be married in the eyes of the land to be married in the eyes of God? I would say yes. Civil authorities are to be obeyed. We see that in Romans 13 and verse 1. "Let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. And relatedly, social decency is to be maintained. Take thought for the things honorable in the sight of all men." Marriage contains both civil and spiritual or religious, divine elements. So, this is where I want to kind of pick up. What then is the purpose of marriage? Well, marriage, according to the Scriptures, fulfills several purposes. One, maybe the most obvious to think of, is the social role. You go back and you look in Genesis chapter 1, and as God is going through the various days of creation, day by day, he declares whatever he created on that day to be good. Until we come to the sixth day, and for the first time in the history of everything, we're told God finds something that was not good. And what was that? That man should be alone. Genesis 2 and verse 18. And so what does God do? He creates woman. He creates a helpmeet. And says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." God is describing here what I'm convinced is the ideal, not the only, but the ideal solution for loneliness. The ideal need for social interaction is a spouse. Those of us that choose to marry, who should be your closest friend? It should be your wife, your husband, your spouse. What should be your closest relationship? It should be your spouse. If there is a social need that is not being met in a marriage, there's quite possibly a problem there that needs to be addressed. If you're closer to somebody else, then you're closer to your spouse. I understand, husbands and wives are going to have some different hobbies, so there'll be some different friendships. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is if there is somebody on the balance that you are closer to than your husband or your wife, there's probably an issue in that relationship that needs to be taken a look at. So marriage fulfills a social role. marriage fulfills a sexual role. As a matter of fact, marriage, according to the Scriptures, is the only acceptable outlet for sexual desire. Go back and look at 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2. This is one of the reasons that Paul focuses upon for marriage. Because of fornications, that is, because of the temptation, because man has been made with a sexual desire that is a very strong desire, and because we very often struggle to control that desire, because of fornications, Paul says, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. That is because any other outlet is sinful in the eyes of God. I know our society doesn't view it that way. I know our society views it as a good time, as kids being kids, as people are going to do it anyway, as you can't expect anything else from them. But God does. Hebrews 13 and verse 4. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the bed be undefiled. For fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. A couple things I want you to notice from that passage. One, he starts off by saying, let marriage be had in honor. What does he mean by that? He goes on to explain it, right? Because he gives us that phrase that relates to it. Let marriage be held in honor and the bed be undefiled. A sexual union, a sexual relationship outside of marriage dishonors the institution of marriage. And consequently, it dishonors the one who gave us the institution of marriage. Second thing we see that in that passage, for fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. This is not just good advice from God. And this is not merely you'll be happier if you follow this, which you will. It's also an issue of judgment. And fornication and adultery unrepented of invites judgment from God. Marriage is to fulfill a social role. It's to fulfill a sexual role. It's to fulfill a familial role. What is the basic unit of the family? The basic unit is the marriage, the husband and wife. And so we read, for example, in Genesis 4 and verse 1, and the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived. And notice that order. There was the marriage before there was the intimacy, before there were children. Paul would say in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 14, and again, notice the order. I desire, therefore, that the younger widows marry, bear children, rule the household, giving no occasion to the adversary for stumbling. Again, notice that order. Also notice, by the way, that the wife, mother, and husband, father are given specific roles within the home. Here we're told that the woman is to rule the household. The husband is the head of the household, and he is to nurture his children, chastening them in the admonition of the Lord, Ephesians 6 and verse 4. Can good and godly children be raised in single-parent homes? They can be. As a matter of fact, there's pretty strong circumstantial evidence that Jesus, for a good portion of his life, was raised in a single-parent home. But we know from virtually every societal study that has been done that there are serious challenges we can avoid within our families when God's plan of a married husband and married wife form the basis for the family. According to some studies, 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 90% of runaway children come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes. 85% of incarcerated young people come from fatherless homes. The challenge of raising children is best met when mother and father are both married and involved. The last point I want to make here on this side idea is that marriage also fulfills an illustrative role. Marriage serves as an illustration for God's love and God's concern for his people. You see this especially in the Old Testament, where very, very often Israel is spoken of directly or in imagery as God's bride, God's wife. I'll give you an example of this. Ezekiel 6, verses 9 and following. God speaking to the people says, "Then washed I thee with water. Yea, I thoroughly washed away thy blood from thee, and I anointed thee with oil. I clothed thee also with broidered work, and shod thee with sealskin. And I girded thee about with fine linens, and covered thee with silk. And I decked thee with ornaments, and I put bracelets upon thine hands, and a chain on thy neck. And I put a ring upon thy nose, and earrings in thine ears, and a beautiful crown upon thy head. Thus wast thou decked with gold and silver, and thy raiment was of fine linens and silk and broidered work, and thou didst eat fine flour and honey and oil, and thou wast exceeding beautiful, and thou didst prosper into royal estate. And thy renown went forth among the nations for thy beauty, for it was perfect, through my majesty which I had put upon thee, saith the Lord Jehovah." The imagery here is of God finding Israel, as it were, just sort of an abandoned orphan on the wayside, taking her in and making her his wife. And so adorning her with all of these beauties and all of these splendors that a king might give to his queen. So it was illustrative. Marriage is to be illustrative of God's love, God's care and concern for his people. It's also, however, illustrative upon the hurt that we inflict towards God when we are unfaithful. Is there a greater betrayal than adultery? Probably not. And yet, that is how sin is portrayed in the Scriptures. Most famous example would, of course, be Hosea. Hosea chapter 1 and verse 2, just as one statement there. God tells Hosea, "Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredom and children of whoredom." That is, marry an unfaithful woman. Raise somebody else's kids. For, he says, the land doth commit great whoredom, departing from Jehovah. Same idea is presented in the New Testament. James says, James 4 and verse 4, "Ye adulteresses, know ye not that friendship of the world is enmity towards God?" Because we are to be in that kind of close-knit marital relationship with God. And so to turn our backs on God is to commit adultery towards him. So, giving a fuller definition of marriage, I apologize, I think that quite as bright there as I wanted on the screen. I would define marriage from a biblical perspective thusly. It is a God-given institution, spiritually and civilly joining one man to one woman for life, for the ultimate benefit of mankind. Does that make sense? Any questions, comments there on the ideas of just sort of defining marriage? Like I said, part of that we went through real quickly. The next thing I want to discuss, and we will not get through all of it this evening, I want to talk about maximizing marriages. Making the very best of them. I came across some alarming ideas. Vicki Lawrence wrote a book in 2014 entitled "The New I Do: Reshaping Marriage for Skeptics, Realists, and Rebels." And in that book, she claims that 6 out of 10 people are unhappily coupled. I'm not exactly sure how she's using that term coupled, other than they're in some sort of relationship, and 60% of them aren't happy with it. Some people are starting to suggest that for life is actually too long for a marriage to last. Chris Donahue wrote, "Now, people are expecting marriages and sex to last for decades because of the longevity medicine and technology afford. And we're starting to realize it may not be possible. for two people to form aligned, congruent lives for 50 years. In other words, when people were getting married in their teens and dying in their mid-30s, and they were only married for maybe 20 years, yeah, sure, marriage for life worked. But now, come on, 50 years together, 60 years together, it's too much. You can't be happy with one person for that long. That's what we're being told. Yet, as we noted, what is God's expectation for the duration of marriage? For life. As a matter of fact, Jesus says, what therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Matthew 19 and verse 6. By the way, have you ever thought about this? Anybody remember how old Adam was when he died? 930. When did Adam get married? Well, as best I can tell, he got married the same day he was created. He was in a marriage for 930 years. Some marriages lasted for centuries. Not, it wasn't just a question of decades. You can have a lengthy, enjoyable, profitable, healthy, enjoyable marriage. We can maximize our marriages. And that's what I want to talk about, some this evening and probably some next week as well. How do we do that? Well, maybe let's start with the obvious and avoid those obvious pitfalls that are going to be a problem for a marriage. By that, I mean, these things are obviously bad. We know that where these things are present, a marriage is going to suffer. Alcohol and drug abuse is going to make for a bad marriage. Physical and emotional abuse is going to make for a bad marriage. Where there is infidelity, where there is pornography, there's going to be a less than maximized marriage. Where there are any types of addictions, even addictions to healthy things. If you're addicted to shopping, if you're addicted to sports, if you're addicted to your phone or games or whatever, if there is something that's getting more of your attention and more of your effort and focus than your spouse, you're going to have a problem in that marriage. Where there is dishonesty, there's going to be a problem in that marriage. You are not going to maximize a marriage while any of these things are present. But of course, just getting rid of the really, really bad things, just getting rid of the bad things by itself doesn't mean you've got a good marriage, right? It just means we don't have a trash marriage. We don't have a horrible marriage. What are some positive things that we can do that will make our marriages better? I want to start with what I know is going to sound strange, so bear me out. You want to maximize your marriage. You want to have the best marriage possible. Put each other second. That might sound strange, especially because I've just argued that the marriage relationship is to be the closest human relationship. That a man should leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. More enduring, more meaningful, more fulfilling, more focused than even the relationship between parent and child ought to be the relationship between husband and wife. What is more, if I'm following the biblical perspective, the biblical pattern, I love my wife even more than I love myself. Because Paul says, husbands, love your wives even as Christ also loved the church and did what? Gave himself up for it. If I can give of myself to make my wife happier and healthier and more fulfilled, then I've got a duty to do that. So if I'm supposed to be more invested in my wife than in my parents or my children or even than myself, what can I possibly mean by putting my wife second? Put God first. The happiest, the most successful, the maximized marriages are those where both husband and wife put God first. But seek ye first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew 6 and verse 33. Jesus himself said, if any man cometh unto me, and hateth not his own father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. Luke 14 and verse 26. My most important relationship is my relationship to God and to Christ. And if I make that my most important relationship, my relationship with my wife, wives' relationships with their husbands, will be a better relationship. How? Have you ever thought about that? Well, for one thing, when God is my focus, I'm going to be a better person, right? Keeping God as my priority will make me a better person. And you want to know how you get better marriages? Have better people. Have people with a stronger idea of who they are and what they're supposed to be. Have people that are in a better place. The marriage will be in a better place. When we put God first, then we're going to focus on the one who designed marriage. It's going to help us heed his advice for what a marriage ought to be and ought to look like. And we'll have better marriages. When we focus on God, when we put him first, that's going to help keep us accountable in our marriage. Those sort of marriage killers we mentioned a slide ago, things like drug and alcohol addiction and infidelities and pornographies, why do people engage in those things? And I realize that's kind of a complicated question. I guess I could tell you one of the reasons that they will continue in those things is because they think they can get away with them, right? They think, I can keep this hidden. My husband will never know. My wife will never know. I can have my cake and eat it too. Or the old joke about the infidelity, you can have your cake and eateth too. That's not the way it works. But when I focus on God, what do I remember? I might be able to keep some secrets from my wife. Who can I not keep secrets from? Can't keep a secret from God. As the wise man says, Proverbs 15 and verse 11, Sheol and Abaddon are before Jehovah. How much more the hearts of the children of men. Remembering that God is watching will help keep me honest and help keep me the kind of husband, the kind of wife that we're supposed to be. Putting God first in our relationship, putting ourselves second, will also deepen our interest in one another. Because now my interest in my wife goes beyond the physical, and it goes beyond even the emotional. It reaches to the spiritual. Because I'm keeping spiritual things as a focus in my life, and therefore I am maximizing my marriage. So what does that look like? Well, that'll look like worshiping together. That'll look like studying together. That'll look like praying together. That'll look like trusting together. You want to maximize your marriage, put God first, and your spouse second. Questions or comments, thoughts on that? Yeah, Brother Dana?
Serge, take it one step forward. Everything you said about this is true about every other relationship.
Yeah, that absolutely would apply to every other relationship. Any other relationship, you want to make that a better relationship, make sure your relationship with God is where it needs to be first and foremost. Absolutely. So maximize relationship. Put each other second, but no lower than second. So, in other words, put your husband, put your wife exactly second on your list. God above them, nobody else. You're going to have a lot of other relationships. You're going to have some very strong and some very close relationships, and that is a good thing. But again, you should never have an earthly relationship more important to you than your spouse. Our first relationship and our closest relationship when we first come into this world is to our parents. But unfortunately, and many of you have experienced this, what happens with parents? They pass on. Children, hopefully, ideally, grow up and move out and form families. That's what we're raising them for, right? That they one day can go off and be their own person. Friends oftentimes move away. Business partners retire. Through all of that, your spouse is going to be there. It's interesting. There's two main sort of warning times, danger zones, where percentages tell us if a marriage is going to end, it's most likely to be in one of these two times. One is within like the first couple of years, when a marriage is just formed, when they're getting used to each other, they're learning to be a married person. That's where a lot of people realize, I made a mistake, and they give up on it. Interestingly, you know the second great danger time? Well, not even necessarily when you lose a kid, when kids move out. When you start to reach that early 40-ish time frame, and the last kid's gone off to college, and now you're in that empty nest sort of a situation, and you know what makes that a danger? It's because possibly for the last 18 years, 20 years, 25 years, depending on however many kids you have and how far they've been spread out, a lot of times, mom and dad, all their attention is on who? Is on their kids. And now, they're literally living in a house with a stranger because they have put kids above spouse for the last couple of decades, and now they don't know what they're doing. God designed marriage to be the pinnacle of human relationships and human intimacies. When God saw that man was alone, and think about this, Adam was in a very unique situation. Adam never had parents, right? Not like you and I did. God saw Adam was alone. He saw that that was an unhealthy thing. It was a bad thing. What did God not make Adam or create for Adam? He didn't make parents. He didn't say, Adam, by the way, here's your mom and dad. Could he have done that? Yeah. He didn't give Adam kids, right? He got to have done that. He didn't give Adam just, hey, Adam, here's a hunting buddy. Here's somebody to go golfing with you or fishing with you on the weekends. What did he create? A wife. And therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife. And here is something you heard here that is used for the husband and wife relationship, that is used for no other relationship. The two shall become one flesh. There is to be no other relationship closer than the husband and wife relationship. I understand. Other relationships may require more attention for a time, right? We have an obligation. We talked about that some this morning. We have an obligation to our parents in their older ages. That what are we supposed to do? Care for them, provide for them. There may be incidences with a parent in extreme declining health that for a period of time, they get more attention. Children in infancy require a lot of attention. But always give time and attention and focus to one another. Neglect will kill a marriage as certainly as active harm. Remember that. Doing nothing is as dangerous to a marriage as actively, those big no-nos that we talked about at the start of this part of the lesson, just as dangerous. Alan Webster made the observation. He says, many home fronts crumble for the simple reason that couples do not spend enough time together to keep the fire burning. Relatedly, and we talked about this some in our Wednesday night class looking at Deuteronomy. According to the law of Moses, when a husband took a new wife, do you remember what he was exempt from for a year? War or military service. What's he supposed to be doing that year? Deuteronomy 24 and verse 5 says, he shall cheer his wife, whom he hath taken. You make her your priority. All right, I'm going to get to this last point. We don't have our bell going off today, so I'm going to go a little bit longer than normal. I won't hold you keep terribly long, but I do want to, this builds off of that idea of don't put any other lower than second. never stop dating if you want your relationship with your spouse to be the very best that it can. To me, when I talk about never stop dating, there's two things I want to include in that. I want to include an action, and I want to include an attitude. And the most successful marriages will continue in both the action and the attitude beyond just that sort of courtship phase of the relationship. What I mean by action is you will continue to make some time for one another and only one another. Today in a situation, and I'll tell you this, I have to try and learn to be careful about this myself. If you are just starting a relationship and you're out on a first date with somebody and they spent 95% of their time in their phone playing a game or chatting with other people or checking on ball scores or checking the stock market, is there going to be a second date? Probably not. But a lot of times, as husbands and wives, we don't make that time just for and exclusively for one another. You know, hey, right now, I'm a spouse, right? I'm not a spouse and a parent. I'm not a spouse and an employee. I'm not a spouse and a friend. I'm not a spouse and a child. For the next 3 hours, honey, I am your husband and nothing else. That might be an anniversary weekend. You know, it might be a quiet dinner. It might be just holding each other for 30 minutes and watching your favorite sitcom. Doing something that says, you are the most important person to me. You might have a standing date night. You might have to schedule it from week to week. You know, hey, look, if you're like me, you kind of sit down on Monday and say, what have I got to get done this week? Okay, here's what I have available. Hey, Heather, you know what? I'm not doing anything on Thursday. How about we go get dinner Thursday? And you make each other a priority. If you can develop some mutual hobbies together, that's even better. Alan Webster makes the observation that the more things a couple does together, living, playing, working, planning, talking, worshiping, the greater likelihood the marriage will be satisfying. Everything you do should be more fun, you know, if you're doing it with your spouse. We say that our spouse is our most important person in our life. Act like it. Make time for it. The other part I include in that idea of never stop dating is that attitude. Because when you're dating somebody, you always are trying to impress them, right? And I don't necessarily mean that in an insincere way. What I mean is you constantly want to be impressing upon them, you matter to me. You are important to me. And so I want to look my very best for you. And I want to give you the most undivided time that I can. And this activity or that activity, it's something that you really wanted to do. And so I want to do it with you. That's the attitude we take into dating very often. You're always concerned about the image you're presenting to them, being attentive to them, just doing little things for them just because. We don't want to lose that. I know you cannot be on your best behavior all the time, right? And as you are married to somebody, you're going to be around your spouse a lot of the time. So some of those characteristics and some of those attributes and some of those personality quirks that you could keep hidden from them when you were only dating, you can't keep hidden from them anymore. But don't lose that desire to want to impress them, to keep showing them that they are special to you. Don't stop doing those little things for them for no other reason than just, hey, you know what? I wanted to. Paul makes an interesting statement. Romans 12 and verse 10. In love of the brethren, be tenderly affectioned one to another, in honor preferring one another, or the English Standard renders that last phrase, outdo one another in showing honor. I tell people a lot of times when I'm doing counseling before a wedding ceremony. That a lot of times people will have this scorekeeping type of approach to a relationship. And they'll keep track of, I did this for them, but they didn't do it for me. And they did this wrong, and so, hey, I'm winning because I've done more for them than they have. What we ought to be doing is always looking for that next thing we could be doing for our partner, our spouse, our husband, our wife, to make them feel more important, more special, more meaningful. That might be fixing a cup of coffee for them, just the way they like. That might mean offering them a massage. That might mean just helping out with some household chores because we know they've had a long day and we know that this needs to be done. Never lose that action and that attitude of wanting to be the best you can for your spouse. We got some more stuff we'll talk about then, Lord willing, next week. But any questions or comments at this point in time? Get ready to wrap up. Have we got somebody? Brother Dan? Okay.
I don't know what the statistics say for almost 6 out of 10 marriages, but I can understand where the unhappiness comes, and it comes from a very poor definition of understanding what real happiness is. And if we got a poor definition of happiness, when those changes take place in one's relationship, and they will take place, I'm going to be unhappy.
You're going to be unhappy. That's true. And that's the thing, especially. We can get into a whole other conversation about that. Especially the way that people today so often associate love with the puppy love sort of stage of it. That emotion, that butterfly, that newness, that excitement. And it's just like a new car will lose that new car smell. Marriages and relationships lose that new car smell, right? I mean, that excitement, that buzz, that, ooh, wow, I can't believe he likes me, that wears off. But that doesn't have to mean that the happiness and the fulfillment and the sustaining of the marriage is gone if we properly understand what we're talking about. That's an excellent observation. Anything else? All right, we're going to break here just for a moment. We'll have our devotional in just a second. Thank you.
Number 297. 297. I want to be a worker for the Lord. I want to love and trust His holy word. I want to sing and pray and be busy every day in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work and pray, I will pray in the vineyard of the Lord. I will work, I will pray, I will labor every day in the vineyard of the 255. 255. That's our devotion.
I want to put before you this afternoon a few hypothetical situations for your consideration. A man deploys a chemical bait near an anthill with the intended goal of killing the 500 to 1,000 or so ants that live therein, and he is a good yard keeper. A woman uses a Clorox wipe on her kitchen counter with the intended purpose of killing 99.9% of the bacteria on that surface, and she's being a good mother and a good housekeeper. An individual takes a rifle and fires into a crowd of moviegoers, concert goers, shoppers, or school children, and he is a monster. What makes the difference? Now, I'm not saying there is no difference. There is a difference. There's an extremely important difference. There is a readily apparent difference. But why the difference? What makes the difference between bacteria and insects and human beings? It's a question that biology and science, at least as they are currently predominantly practiced, are not prepared to answer, at least not prepared to answer properly. In 2006, Dr. Eric Pianka was named the Distinguished Texas Scientist of the Year, and as part of his award speech, he condemned, quote, the idea that humankind occupies a privileged position in the universe. He went on to say that we are no better than bacteria. Dr. Pianka is not alone or in any way out of the mainstream of scientific thinking. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The God Delusion, wrote, the granting of uniquely special rights to cells of the species Homo sapiens is hard to reconcile with the fact of human evolution. The humanness, he goes on to say, of an embryo's cell cannot confer upon it any absolutely discontinuous moral status. James Rachels wrote a book entitled Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. And in that book, he concluded that when the moral implications of evolution are fully understood, then human life will no longer be regarded with the kind of superstitious awe that it is awarded in traditional thought. When the official starting point, claimed by many in our society, is that human life is nothing special, can we really be shocked and surprised and outraged when people act as if human life is nothing special? And I suspect that as the voices proclaiming the idea that human life is nothing special, as those voices grow louder, as those voices grow more numerous, then tragically the hands willing to take that view to its logical end will become more numerous and more gruesome. There is a difference between bacteria and insects and humanity, but you'd struggle to find it in any modern textbook. Go back to a very ancient book. We read in the very first chapter of that book, and God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the ground after its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let us make man. Now notice this difference. Not after their kind, like we said of every other kind of animal life. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. The next verse goes on to tell us that God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And then verse 31 of that same chapter, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. There is a fundamental difference between animal life and human life. And thus there should be a fundamental difference between how we treat animal life and human life. Genesis chapter 9, shortly after the flood, God told Noah, "Every moving thing that liveth shall be food for you. As the green herb have I given you all." For the first time, divine permission was given to put meat on the menu. And yet God said, while I'm allowing you to kill animals for food, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Genesis 9 and verse 6. If we as a society are truly interested in not ending up in the same place time and time and time again, specifically mourning a mass murder event and wondering how on earth did this happen, and if we are truly willing to consider all avenues to prevent future tragedies, then let me invite us to reconsider our ethical starting point. Because we're going to struggle to end up anywhere else if we keep starting from the same point, that animals and humans are no different. And this is a charge that needs to be led by Christians. And the ethics of valuing human life need to be adhered to in all things and not just murder. I want you to notice what James says, James 3, beginning at verse 8. Where he says, "The tongue can no man tame. It is a restless evil. It is full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we the Lord and Father, and therewith curse we men, who are made after the likeness of God. Out of the same mouth cometh forth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not be so." We need to recognize the foundational dignity of human life and behave accordingly in all things. Not merely avoiding physical harm and not even merely avoiding emotional harm with our words. We need to be actively concerned about the well-being, the physical, emotional, spiritual well-being of our fellow man because they are made in the image of God. And we need to recognize these things in all men. Those of different races, those of different genders, those of different political philosophies, those of different nations, those of different behaviors. All men were made in the image of God. All men are worthy of being treated as such. And then we need to realize that treating all men with respect includes treating myself thusly as well. We're so often our own worst critics. I imagine most of the time, most of us could say, nobody has a lower view of me than I have of myself. But you have infinite dignity. You have infinite worth and infinite value because you were created in the image of an infinite God. And to that infinite God, we were worth the life of His Son. And if God, who knows us even better than we know ourselves, still loves us and still desires us, still wants what is best for us, then shouldn't we still want the best for us as well? And ultimately, what is best for you is to be right with God. Are you right with God this afternoon? Or do you need to make a change? Do you need to come to Jesus Christ? Do you need to be baptized into the blood of your Savior for the forgiveness of your sins? Are you a Christian who needs to make things right with your Lord once more? We offer you at this time this afternoon the Lord's invitation. If you need to come, please come as we stand and as we sing.
Number 255. 255. I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, things that will lure my sight. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved to go to the Savior, leaving my sin and strife. He is the true one, He is the just one, He has the words of life. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still will I enter in. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. This table still prepared for anybody hadn't had a chance to partake of the Lord's Supper today? Raise your hand. If not, our closing song will be number 738, and afterwards, Mr. Billy McVeigh, Brother McVeigh will have our closing prayer. 738. We will glorify the King of Kings. We will glorify the Lamb. We will glorify the Lord of Lords, who is the great I am. Lord Jehovah reigns in majesty. We will bow before his throne. We will worship him in righteousness.